expected it to be quite quiet in here today. I think when I was asked what I wanted to, well, I was asked to speak, and then I asked people what they wanted to hear about back in February. And at the time, people were very excited because quite a number of the free schools had been having quite a lot of problems at that time. So Deborah, who was obviously in charge, asked me to speak about free schools, that being the thing that people are used to hearing me speak about. It's what I will talk about today. And because there's not many people in here, if there are any questions or there's anything specifically, perhaps you're thinking of opening a free school, if you're campaigning against a free school, I'm fairly agnostic on them in general. So if there's anything that you wanted to hear and you don't hear that today, hopefully we'll have a bit of time to be able to talk about it. Come in, it's absolutely fine. If you were expecting to see me, if you weren't, run now. Were you looking for Tom?
Tom Sherry.
Yeah, see, exactly. I said this to you guys, didn't I? That's fine. My soul is with you. So it started with the images, 4 images of what people think of as the free schools policy. When I hear people talk about it, I very often hear people talk as if it's one of the top 2. Either free schools are this ray of sunshine which are going to solve so very many problems, or they feel as if free schools are basically stabbing them in the back because they are working very hard in their community, in the school that they're in, and some dastardly person has had the audacity to come along and open a school next door with all of these extra resources, and they're stealing everything from them, and so they feel as if their back has been stabbed. There are also people who, at the moment, I think it's a very political argument, feel as if we're just burning money on very, very few schools. They see that there's been £1 billion to be spent on these schools, and it feels like there aren't many of them. Well, I want to challenge that perception, because although there haven't been that many of them, a lot more are opening, and it might well be that it gathers pace. Come on in. The final image is the one that I always pick for free schools, only because I do think that there's a lot of defence around free schools at the moment. A lot of people are very invested in it, and so it can feel as if, you know, they're quite prickly and you can't get in there, but there's a very soft underbelly, and the history of kind of new innovations of schools, and what I'll talk about in terms of what happened in the US, is when similar policies happened abroad, some states have done incredibly well with very, very similar policy in the US, and they've gone on, and we hear about their successes a lot. What you haven't heard is that there are some states in the US where free schools, the equivalent of, opened, and actually those states went, this is a disaster, it's all gone horribly wrong, we just want to close them down as quickly as possible. And states like Idaho and Iowa have ended up with very, very few, about 8 left, and are just gone, we'll just pretend that never happened. So in terms of who I am, my name is McInerney. I was a teacher for 6 years in the east of London. I've spent the last 2 years in the University of Missouri. That was really on the back of what was a series of, at the time, felt like very quick blogs that I did in 2010, which was predicting some of the failures around free schools. It became a booklet that still sells. Bizarrely, after 4 years, no one else has really written anything other than Toby Young, and people have quite strong opinions about him. No one else has really written a book about how to open a free school or what might go wrong, so we still sell quite well in terms of that booklet. Hi. And on the back of writing those blogs, it becoming a booklet and me getting associated with free schools, the Fulbright scholarship, which at that time I'd applied for something else, actually turns into whether or not free schools are likely to work or not likely to work. So I've spent the last 2 years looking at free schools in the US, looking at them here, trying to figure out if what I randomly predicted in 2010 on the basis of reading not that much about it at the time was correct. And by the end of this talk, what I would like to get your thoughts on, and also where I've got to, is what I actually think will happen next. So if I was sitting down writing a series of blogs now, like I did in 2010, to say where I think in 4 years' time we might be with free schools, the 3 things that I think what will happen next. Coming in, we're still on instructions, unless you're looking for Tom, in which case you ought to run in a different direction. So first things first, what are free schools? Ultimately, they are just new academies. It's the simplest way to explain it. But instead of them being selected, the people who open them, by local authorities, they are selected via a central government process. That was quite controversial. I think it got a little bit lost in the message, because at the time it felt like anyone was going to be allowed to open a school and lots of people could apply for them. But essentially they are just new academies where people applied to the government and they said, we'd like to do this, and the government either said yes or no, and then helped out with getting that underway. How many are there? So one of the big things when you talk about free schools is people go, well, they're quite small. And they are quite small in terms of the numbers of them. This is from Watchstead, who sort of keep a track on the Ofsteds of free schools, which I'll talk about, and also how many of them there are. Ultimately, very few opened in 2011. That makes sense. If you think that the government only got in May 2010, and by September the following year we're opening schools under this policy, it was very quick, but it was very small. However, 55 the next year, 95 the next year, there are currently 122, I believe, approved to open, although not all of those will open this September, some have deferred. That's about 292 current approvals. So it's not a huge number yet, but it's not small. I mean, to open nearly 300 schools is quite a lot, and it's likely to be that more schools will open, especially as we need more school places. There's a slight difference between new academies that are coming through different programmes and free schools which are selected by central government. But ultimately we have this thing now, which we've had for a few years, where new schools are opening, they're selected by central government, by people applying, and it's worth paying attention to even if it's not a huge number. I thought because we were in the north we would just have a look at the north picture in particular. It's interesting to me that Leeds, which is where we are, is very crowded. If you think that there aren't that many on this map, there's 175 on the map, and the Leeds area actually has quite a number of them. There are also, I know they're rural areas, but you know, there are big parts of the country where none are open. And you would expect them to crowd into areas with big populations. But I still find it quite interesting, for example, that Nottingham doesn't have many. Sheffield is an example there where there's not really any. So we have to think about why might it be that we're getting crowds all in certain areas, and is that likely to continue? Are we doing anything to spread it out? As far as I can see, I think we're just going to keep seeing a multiplier effect of the ones where there are lots. There'll be more because there's some capacity there. So people go, oh, I've seen a free school open, I know that there's people around, I can get some help. Whether that's a good thing is something we need to consider. So the big question then is, are they any good? And I asked a few people, you know, what do you want to know about free schools? And the two questions that come back is, do they work? And are they stealing our money? Seems a very big concern. Are they any good is a really hard question to answer, especially for any new school, because you're going to have a number of years where you don't have results. What we do have at the moment are 56 Ofsteds, which is very, very little to go on. Which is why I kind of go crazy the other week. I watched BBC Question Time, I can't remember who it was, and someone said they're 3 times more likely to be outstanding. And I thought, well, 3 times more likely than what? 3 times more likely to be outstanding than failing? 3 times more likely to be outstanding than another type of school? So it's really easy to go with statistics that sound very good. And the other one, which is really coming out in a lot of the political speeches at the moment, is they outperform in terms of good and outstanding, particularly outstanding, other state schools, but watch out for the caveat of under the current Ofsted inspection regime. And that's really important because Ofsted happens more often if you're not very good. So if we have a new Ofsted regime, we would expect more people who were not very good last time to be selected first in the round. Because free schools have to be done within a time frame, all of them are being sampled. So if you imagine what you would have is sort of 2 barrels of apples, some of which are bad and some of which are good. In this one, we're just taking them all out, and in this one, we're actively selecting first more of the bad ones. You can't really compare the outcomes of the two. So when anyone says, you know, what's currently happening with statistics, there's the small sample problem, but even more is that weird current Ofsted regime statistic. Just be a little bit sceptical. I would expect I would hope free schools, if you're having a whole sample, that they are really pulling forwards quite some. What we can say, it's a shame this diagram's the way it is, but of the ones that were published by 3 AM yesterday morning. So if any came out yesterday, they're not in this. And again, this is from Watchstead, who provided this. The green are the outstanding, the blue is good, the yellow is requires improvement, and the red is the inadequates. And what we can see is there's a good, healthy number who are outstanding. It's actually 10 of them at the 11 of them at the moment. The goods is about fine. I think the thing that has been problematic in the press, and again this comes down to how you want to take that third grade. Those of you who are in schools who've had 3 grades recently will probably feel this most keenly. This was the grading which was historically named as satisfactory and then became requires improvement. And that name change has brought with it a feeling and a shift that requires improvement is now a failing school, as so 3 and 4 is suddenly a sort of failing grade and 1 and 2 are an acceptable grade. And I think that's been quite problematic because what you've got are 25.9%, a good chunk of these schools do require improvement. And what we also saw with a number of those requires improvements that came through was a switch in the rhetoric around the press releases. So where at the very beginning free schools were going to be these high quality, amazing schools that would bring in choice from the outset, there was suddenly this thing of, well actually it's quite hard to open schools, so obviously they're going to require improvement because they've only been open for a year. And everyone sat around and went, well yeah, we did think this was going to be quite difficult, turns out. So what I would say on this is, are they any good? They look like they're going to have a similar distribution to any other type of school, any other type of policy. Some will do very well, a lot of them will do around the middle, some will do very badly. The number is sometimes overplayed in terms of inadequate, so the 9.3% is quite small. And there are schools that people think are inadequate that weren't. So King Science Academy, which particularly in this area is getting a lot of attention, actually got a 3, it got a requires improvement. It wasn't a failing school, but is sometimes considered failing because there has been a big media storm around other things to do with the school's finances. So the picture on free schools at the moment, very, very small picture, very difficult to compare. Probably what we'll see if you're going to go with the US example, almost every state there finds that in the end, unless you do very specific things like only open very few of them and you only open them for bright students and you really carefully manage how many you open, you tend to find that the distribution ends up about the same as any other school. Which brings in questions about value for money, but you know, you've got to open schools and they're always going to cost a lot, so it's hard to balance those things out. That was going to be, I've not got Wi-Fi on here, so I'm not going to go through to it. That was the map for the north and the south. Again, because we're in the north, I thought it might be quite interesting to look at it. There isn't a huge pattern. At one time when they were first coming in, it did look like the better ones were going to be in the south and not in the north, and as someone from the north, I can imagine my parents sitting around grumbling about how this would work in London and not anywhere else. But it doesn't look like that will be the case. It's quite random. One of the interesting things that does come up is how much, because free schools, like all academies, but free schools seem to have used this ability not to hire qualified teachers or teachers who are training to get QTS, how much that's actually happening. Numbers are a little bit light here. This is all of the schools of the 53 that returned figures on this in the first census. These are the ones who had more than 20% of their staff without QTS, and many of them not on QTS routes, although not all. It was interesting to me, I did a quick check. None of these has currently been given an outstanding. Some have been given goods, sort of split between goods and requires improvement. It's a very small number, so I don't think we can draw anything from it, but I was just looking for one, really, when I thought, well, can I find one school that's gone down this route that therefore gets outstanding for teaching? And so far, no one has proven me wrong on it. It's interesting that, and I think it came up at the time that King Science Academy was one of the ones with 74.5%, but you know, the inadequates aren't necessarily in here either. So there's also the fact that you can have very qualified staff, and they're not necessarily all gelled together to give you a brilliant school. So it's not necessarily going to be that qualified teachers will necessarily save you either way, but I do think it's interesting that none of the outstanding schools currently use non-qualified, or many non-qualified teachers that they're not training up. So then, what do we learn from looking at the big failures? And I'm going to defend this practice just for a moment because I get told off. This is usually the bit where, obviously he's at Policy Exchange today, Jonathan Simons sends me annoyed tweets telling me I shouldn't look at the failures. I should look at the successes, that's what we should do. There is a reason why I looked at the failures right from the outset in 2010. Before I became a teacher, I actually I did work on trains, and I worked on train franchising. One of the interesting things about train franchising is when it moved over from state control to privatisation, there were a number of problems. And actually the system is not that different to contracting schools, which is what free schools effectively operate as. It's not quite privatisation because there's not profit involved in the same way. But it's an interesting analogy. And what happened there was the Hatfield crash really exploded a lot of problems that had come about during the changeover that no one had wanted to talk about. So although lots of things were happening with train safety and with train punctuality that we were trying to cover up, it wasn't until there was a sort of big failure. And when people, get injured and die, people tend to pay attention. It's why we pay attention if someone dies in hospital, they'll have a mortality meeting. Why if there's an air crash, there's a meeting afterwards. This isn't to say that there isn't huge successes, and I will talk about those. But the big failures can show up some of the things that we don't really want to talk about, some of the things that we think we can just pretend aren't real. And in fact, they are real. So that's why I focused on the failures from the outset, and if you look at what's going to go on, you can get around it. One of the interesting things with trains is, and I know people are very touchy about rail privatisation, actually things did get much better, and within 4 or 5 years after that crash, things were much better than they had been previously under the state system. So it is possible to balance out both of these things. You can highlight failures and think things should nevertheless become better. So, big failures so far. This is what I predicted back in 2010 off of the back of what I'd read at the time about US charter schools. The first two are about opening schools. Probably the most obvious point I made, but it has been, it comes back all of the time, is that if you focus too much on how brilliant you are and don't bring people on side, that's a problem because local people don't like you, and you'll spend a lot of your time trying to defend yourself, and that can be very bad for you, especially when it comes to the most difficult part in all of this, which is getting a building. That has been one of the major problems and blocking points of people, especially who've got through application but haven't managed to get on to open up schools. James O'Shaughnessy, who's leading the Floreat Academy Trust at the moment, who are opening or have applied to open a free school and are opening an academy, wrote a great blog this week about problems with free schools. And he said, the buildings issue is still out there 4 or 5 years later. He did come up with some suggestions about how you could get central lists of buildings available, but it's such an enormous problem, it was always going to be difficult, and that has proven to be true. What's more interesting is the next ones, which tend to be the two in the middle are around planning and just the bit before